in meeting with clients that I've met with, there seems like there's this inverse relationship where as kind of acting out sexual behavior goes up, the ability to kind of be emotionally and physically intimate, like in a real way, goes down.
Yeah.
Would you say that's fair? Hello, welcome to another episode, season 3, I think, of Finding Peaks. I'm Jason Friesema, Chief Clinical Officer, and you'll notice we've had a change of set. I think we are moving toward a podcast feel, and I'm really excited about it. I'm hoping it'll give us an opportunity to have even more intimate and close conversations. Joining me today, Zach LeFever. Zach is a therapist, primary therapist here at Peaks Recovery, and came to us from Durango, Colorado, where he was working in crisis. And I'm really excited to have Zach on. Today we are going to be kind of tackling the topic of sex addiction. Obviously doing a lot of work in this space. As far as mental health and substance use, it is frequent that people do have ongoing process addictions, so addictions that are not necessarily to a chemical or something, but to a behavior or a set of behaviors. And sex addiction is certainly one that we look at a fair amount. So, Zach, I don't know, maybe start with, let's kind of define what sex addiction even is. Like, how do we define that? Because I think it's a pretty broad range of behaviors that can fall under that.
Yeah, I think that's some of the issue for many is what does it mean to define? Like, what is sex addiction? I think that's one of the questions that a lot of people ask. And part of the problem is defining it. Because like any addiction, right, it can be kind of personal in terms of how they define it, what that label means for them and whatnot. But really the simplest way that I can think of defining sex addiction is involving the idea of reliance and compulsive behavior and involving some area of unwanted behavior. Yeah. So if there's those three things involved, I think we can have a good idea of what's going on.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I know, even looking at like the DSM and substance use disorder, where there's like a tolerance, where, that often happens with people with sex addiction, where the behaviors kind of tend to ramp up for people to receive the desired effect from it. A withdrawal can occur if somebody isn't available, if they aren't acting out in that issue. Great deal of time spent in that, harming relationships, causing harm to one's mental health, like on and on it goes. And so it is interesting how those parallels manifest themselves, I guess. So how have you come across this as an interest in your therapeutic approach?
Yeah, it really started in grad school. So I, as a male therapist in a primarily non-male industry, if we can put it that way.
That's probably fair.
I was one of 2 male therapists at the first place that I worked in private practice. And so the influx of patients that I got, of clients that I got, were mainly men from the ages of 18 to 35 or 40. And I think with the clients that I got, was noticing that the most of them were coming in with some sort of unwanted sexual behavior that they wanted to talk about.
Yeah.
And so that just kind of piqued my interest into what's happening, what's going on, how prevalent is this, and the world and the clients I'm going to interact with, and then how does this relate with other mental health disorders, and so it's kind of what got me started. It was really just having clients come to me and be like, this is what I want to talk about.
Yeah, it is remarkable how tied this topic is to his shame, right? Like, I think I find people have plenty of shame around substance addiction and even mental health issues, but to talk about unwanted sexual behavior, like, people tend to really go into a shame spiral with that, for sure. How have you begun to approach that, and how do we talk about it at Peaks? I think that's an interesting question.
Yeah. So I'll go into a little bit of how I learned to talk about it before I became a therapist. And so I grew up in what is called purity culture, right? So this idea of, very shame-based culture of, if you're not pure, whatever that word means,
Right.
then you're a bad person. And so that's kind of the world I grew up in. And I think that's what I noticed is that's where a lot of my clients came from as well. And so, I think what that means is coming in with, like you said, the involvement of shame into the conversation. And I think, with shame, there's what I believe are two antidotes, is kindness and curiosity. And so just asking my clients, like, are you willing to enter into this space about talking about this and trying to be kind to yourself and being curious about what's going on?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. And I think that can be so relieving of that shame for sure. And I know, certainly in the work that I've done with clients on this sex addiction issue, I took from that kind of there's these 3 concentric circles that SAA talks about, Sex Addiction Anonymous talks about, that I was trained on when I did the Certified Sex Addiction Therapist training module, I think through the Meadows. And these concentric circles require people kind of in that middle circle to define, they call it the red circle, like the things that they want, the behaviors they want to eliminate, right? And that takes some work and some time. Like again, with if somebody comes in addicted to heroin, like it's really obvious you want to stop using heroin, right? Like that becomes really apparent. But I think it takes some time and some clever clinical work, I think, to walk through the behaviors that people want to eliminate that they would then consider themselves sober, if you will, from those behaviors. And then the next circle out was kind of the yellow circle, and those were like the warning signs, like maybe being on the internet when everyone else was in bed, or driving down certain streets, or texting people after a certain time, that don't necessarily mean that somebody's in a relapse, but it does mean that somebody's kind of in that warning sign area. And then the green circle of that kind of contained information about, like, these are the things that are going to keep me, these are the things I want to go toward, if you will, like, whether it's some sort of meditation, a prayer, or meetings or therapy or whatever. I don't know. Are you familiar with that model at all? And like,
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah, and I think that works in really nicely actually with a lot of process addictions, because it takes some time, I think, to identify what exactly people are needing to treat, and what they want to work on, and how they're knowing they're being successful in that process.
Yeah, and that kind of ties into, right, we've had this shift of language, and as we talk about it, because for a long time it was referred to as problematic behavior.
Yeah.
But that got into, like, who defines what's problematic.
Right.
And so, I think the key term that I use with clients is unwanted. Like, if it's unwanted, then that's something, or if you're the one that's saying it's problematic, right, that we can go there. But like, if it's something that you want to change, then that, that's key, that's something that we can talk about.
Yeah. So you mentioned purity culture a little bit, which, I've found also, like, implies a fair amount of shame, to be honest with you. And there isn't a lot of gray area or ability to kind of explore sexuality in that culture. What other factors do you think kind of drive sex addiction?
Yeah. So I think we can look at it from a diagnostic lens, where we can say, there is really no diagnosable condition called a sex addiction, right? There was some kind of back and forth about trying to get a hypersexuality disorder, but in the DSM, I think most recently that was shot down. So I think that the best way that I've come to think about sex addiction, and I think what research supports, is that it's more about intimacy than it is about sex itself. Yeah. And so as we come to approach it, and whether it's in treatment or just in conversation, I think looking at it as more of an intimacy disorder probably frames it in the best light, because we find that it's less about the actual act of sex or whatever the behavior is that they don't want, and it's more about the desire for connection. And I think that's really important. Okay.
Will you unpack that a little more? Like, okay, so, because I could see that being a little bit of a leap, right? Going from intimacy, or sex addiction is an intimacy disorder, like, bridge that gap. Like, it seems like there's space there.
Yeah. So I think the bridge has to do with this big word in psychology and counseling call attachment.
Yeah.
So for a long time, and still the primary view of sex addiction is that it has to do with, maybe we can say where it comes from is usually some sort of insecure attachment from, when you were younger, or some sort of traumatic situation. And so, or what they found, or both, yeah. So often together. And so what they found is, I think what we're seeing is that as we look at what sex provides, right? There is the actual feeling it provides in terms of like the neurochemical response of it feels good, and pleasure is something that I think humans enjoy, but it also provides that sense of connection that I think is at the core of the human heart desire, which is to feel wanted and seen and known. And so I think that's the gap, hence the bridge.
Yeah, and it seems like in meeting with clients that I've met with, there seems like there's this inverse relationship where as kind of acting out sexual behavior goes up, the ability to kind of be emotionally and physically intimate, like in a real way, goes down.
Yeah.
Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, I think so, because as like you said earlier, when the brain gets those sort of neurochemical reaction that feels good, it shuts down some of those receptors, and it's like that's too much, and so we need more and more each time to feel that same amount of pleasure, or that same good feeling, and so we often that results in like escalation of behavior, or the normal or typical way we would find that connection and that intimacy no longer works. And so we have to be creative, and we have to find new ways to feel wanted, and so that that often can lead to a diminished, whether it's with a partner or whether it's with even friends, that can lead to diminished real world relationships, because those no longer provide that chemical response we're looking for.
I think that's a great way to look at it. How does pornography itself kind of work its way into here? Because it's obviously tied in there.
Yeah, absolutely. It can be, and I think so. Pornography is an interesting one, because there is, like, even not from just a research level, like there is plenty of research to show like what it does to the brain and how it just impacts our ability to engage in intimate relationships in the real world scenarios, but really it's sex without the risk, right? It's connection without the risk of rejection, and I think that's an important thing to think about, because I think the risk makes it worth it. Is when we think about what makes a really good intimate relationship, whether it's a marriage or whether it's a friendship, it's the risk of what if this goes wrong, and being able to work through that. But pornography gets rid of that risk and says you just get the feel-good stuff, and you're by yourself, and so you get to control what's happening, and there's that challenge there.
Yeah, fair. And I think I've noticed too, the reward that you mentioned with that can come with pornography tends to be pretty short-lived, right? Like I think risk and reward, like being emotionally intimate with a partner or with your friends is high risk, or higher risk than not. But the reward of that is that intimacy and that connection, which is, I think, what we are actually wired to receive, right? Like I think as people, we have this need for connection, and it can get distorted pretty quickly, I think, in terms of sex addiction.
Right.
You haven't been at Peaks an incredible amount of time, but like how has this worked into kind of how you treat clients here at Peaks?
Yeah. I mean, when we look at it, like the treatment for sex addiction is really not that much different than the treatment for what we would call typical addiction, whether it be with substances or it's we find that this idea of kind of this desire for connection and attachment is there just as it is for a substance addiction as it is for a sexual addiction, and so treatment really doesn't look that different. And so what I find is different is the maybe the shame that is brought in around it. Yeah. And the conversation that they're willing to have is not one that's as open in group as it is in like an individual session, where they're probably less likely to go into the sexuality conversation in a group context. So that's probably where it's going to help the most.
Yeah.
But are more willing to go with like their individual therapist and talk about it.
What I think, I mean, even the things that we've mentioned too, like attachment style, we look at that at Peaks and kind of explore that with people. We also mentioned that, you know, some trauma, sometimes unwanted sexual contact and that sort of thing can lead to these types of behaviors. And those are also things that we deal with at Peaks. Because I do think, again, kind of quoting TJ Woodward from Conscious Recovery again, that, you know, honestly, acting out sexually it tends to be this brilliant strategy for coping with whatever it is, whether it's this anxious attachment or avoidant attachment or insecure attachment, or whether it's kind of dealing with the pain from trauma or, you know, even kind of neglect from childhood and that sort of thing, or just, or kind of some stunted development sexually due to purity culture where one wasn't able to kind of talk and explore these domains. We do, I think, work pretty diligently, I think, to work on those underlying issues and kind of help with that.
Right.
I guess I kind of look at it too like this. There's outside in work to do, which is about kind of building what does sexual sobriety, if you will, look like. And that doesn't mean not having sex, by the way. I want to be really clear.
Yeah.
It's a sex positive approach for sure. But there's some outside in, like what are the behaviors that have to change, what are behaviors that need to be added, but there's that also inside out journey that people have to go on as well, where they get to kind of explore what are some of these underlying issues and what can kind of relieve some of my desire to kind of act out in these ways too.
And I think it's important to say too, it's not just behavior modification, right? Like we're not just talking about like, how do we behave in a way that makes us feel better about ourselves, or how do we behave in a way that aligns more with my values? I think it's how do I, because I think in that conversation, right, is this idea of, you know, there's this term they call sexual incongruence, right? Where if you have this value of like, maybe let's use purity, right? Let's use like abstinence as a value. Yeah. And then you are unable to, for whatever reason, live up to that value, right? That's where cognitive dissonance steps in. It's because you have this whole gap of like, my values don't matter with my behavior. I don't know what to believe about myself. And so, you know, I think this stepping into the conversation and talking about, you know, what it is you value, what it is. I ask clients all the time, you know, I help them establish what I call a kingdom, right? What do you love? What do you hate? Though that establishes like the kingdom that's ahead of you, that you have in front of you, and what, you know, what behavior, if you want to just talk about behavior, what behavior fits into that kingdom you have in terms of helping you go towards the things you love and avoiding the things you hate.
That makes a ton of sense. So put sex addiction into your kingdom metaphor there.
Yeah.
What do people like? Give a practical example if you could.
Yeah.
How that works.
Yeah. So in that kingdom metaphor, right, we have this idea of like, let's imagine someone is the ruler of their kingdom, right? So they're in charge of, you know, how it looks and what's happening and the, you know, all that stuff. And so they get to pursue the things they love, and they get to avoid the things that bring them displeasure. And so, you know, if someone loves sex, if someone loves connection, if someone loves, you know, exploring their sexuality, those are things they actually love. How do we do that in a way that promotes wholeness and integrity and whatever they want to define that as? And so, and then on the dislike or the hate side, which is a pretty strong word, but on the hate side of stuff, like maybe they, I'll talk to clients about, you know, they hate the feeling of being lonely. They hate the feeling of being by themselves. They hate the, you know, the disconnection that comes with pornography. They hate that aspect of it. And so what are the changes we can make to still find those kind of like fulfillment pieces of it that you can live into and pursue the things that you loved while avoiding the things that really just make you unhappy?
Yeah. I mean, it's certainly what I appreciate about what you say is it's obviously a very client-centered approach where people, we're not kind of pushing our values onto somebody. And that's what gets tricky around this too. And I think a lot of early kind of sex addiction treatment kind of came from that purity culture too, of like get fully abstinent and get kind of back into what would be a traditional view of sexuality. And I think there's a lot of room to operate in your kingdom, if you will, of healthy sexual behavior.
And for some, right, because it's so individual, it might mean abstinence for a period of time.
Yeah.
Like it just like we go into, substance addiction, like it might mean complete abstinence or sobriety for a period of time.
Yeah.
And so really it's just kind of person specific and depends on the client himself.
Yeah, that is an interesting point. Because I have seen it used, and I can honestly say I've asked some clients to do that too, where it's like the compulsive and obsessive behavior is so intense that a short-ish period of celibacy just is a way to kind of hit the reset button and kind of, I think it would be similar to what kids today call a tolerance break or something on like cannabis use or something, where it's like, I got to take a minute and like kind of and hit the reset button. And that does take some time.
Yeah. And it also helps kind of make this distinction for them between like that they can still be intimate. That doesn't mean they have to be sexual.
Right.
And at the same time, sexuality also doesn't include physical contact. And so you can have, they can still explore their sexuality and be in intimate relationships. That doesn't mean they have to actually have sex.
Yeah.
And so I think that's an important distinction, because often they, clients will get into this framework of like, the only way I can, be intimate with someone is through, this behavior that I want to stop. And so I don't know how to actually have relationships, friendships even, without this behavior. And so having them make this distinction of like intimacy and physical activity, right? I think that can be really helpful for some.
Yeah, and it's certainly like offering tools to help people learn how to be intimate.
Yeah.
Learn how to identify our emotions so that we can share those with other people. Learn how to have a conversation, learn how to be open, learn how to listen.
Yeah, I think it starts with intimacy with self.
Yeah.
Right? Like one of my favorite frameworks to kind of work with people trying to work through some unwanted behavior, I know you are a fan of it, is IFS.
Yeah.
Right, which is all about kind of reducing the shame behind parts of ourselves that act in ways we don't want to.
Yeah.
And trying to develop curiosity about like what's the actual desire there, like what's the good in what's happening,
right?
And that we can show compassion towards ourselves in that moment and don't have to be like, you're doing a bad thing.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. I do love to say too that all behavior makes sense in context, and when we can understand our own context of our behaviors and without the judgment and be like, okay, I see how I got here, we can find and foster some compassion, I think, for ourselves oftentimes.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I appreciate this conversation, Zach. I think it's been helpful. I think this is an issue that isn't talked about enough. I think it's a thing that a lot of people, I think, want to talk about and need to talk about, but it's hard to find the space to do that. So I appreciate you coming on and,
of course,
onto your first podcast and talking about sex addiction. It'd be easier to talk like NFL football or something, but this is probably more important.
I could probably talk more about this than that. So.
Okay, that's probably fair. All right, with that, we'll go ahead and sign off. Please find us at peaksrecoverycenters.com or look us up on Google and follow us on Facebook. And with that, we are out.